Well, I'm married to a West African guy who comes from Guinea, and it's a difficult situation because he comes from fairly extreme poverty. We're both of us musicians, so me living there is really not a possibility. So we've been married quite a long time, and we decided that him living here would be the sensible thing to do. Neither of us have got a great deal of money. And there tends to be, I think before this happened to me, I think I also had the naive idea that if you are a British citizen and you are married to somebody who's not a British citizen, then they are allowed to come here because they're married to a British citizen. And when you actually start doing applications, you realise that that is not true at all. There are a very large amount of hoops to jump through, and the hoops get more and more difficult, and there are more of them as time goes on. And also that the system is not fair. And that's quite a difficult thing to discover. You know, that we began by applying for a visit visa because it felt like a sensible thing to do. You know, he comes from one culture, I come from another culture. He could come and visit me in my culture. We could see how that was in terms of how he got on here and also how the relationship was while he was here, to see, you know, how that would work. And that is almost impossible to do because you just get refused. And you get refused on the grounds that the person is unlikely to leave. So there's this kind of prejudice in the system, which makes trying to be sensible very, very difficult. Because in lots of ways, if you're married to a person who comes from a very different place to you, having a bit of a trial, you know, feels like a sensible thing to do before you invest a huge amount of time and money in doing something that might not work. And the entire reason that you get refused is, I'm trying to remember what the wording is, reasonable doubt is the wording. That basically they say, he's married to you, he's poor, he won't leave. And that's kind of it. And I didn't understand quite how much of a game it was. So the first time we applied, we got refused, and we got refused on the grounds, I thought, that there was no photograph on his bank book. And you can reapply as many times as you like because you pay for it. So we waited, I think, what was the statutory 3 months. We got a letter from his bank with a photo, you know, saying, because we thought that's the problem. And we reapplied and we got turned down again. And I can't actually remember what the reason was the second time, and then I started to talk to other people, and that, you know, you end up in forums because that's the only place that you ever get any information. And I know one or two people in the legal system, but I don't know anybody in immigration law. And everybody's kind of going, that's quite strange, you know. And then you start talking to people who work in immigration and they go, yeah, you know, you haven't got any money. That's the problem. You haven't got any money. And without that, there is absolutely no way that, you know, so you then find out that it's a sensible thing to put a very large amount of money in the other person's bank account. And even then, they often turn you down. And I didn't have a very large amount of money to put into his bank account. Anyway, we got turned down, I think, 3 or 4 times for a visit visa. And it became really obvious that we were not going to get a visit visa. And you also get into an interesting thing with the system where they turn you down because they've turned you down. So, you know, the more it goes on, the more difficult it is because they, you know, you've got visa refused stamped on something. And so it's kind of visa refused because of visa refused. And you start to realise, you know, I'm not naive. And the kind of anti-immigration polemic that this government has increasingly ramped up, you know, you kind of, I suppose one of the things that this process has done for me is really eroded my belief in civil rights. Because, you know, I had this feeling that, as a British citizen, I had a right under Article 8 to, what they call an extended family life. I used to be able to quote Article 8, but I haven't done any applications for a while. But, if you... And it sort of feels fundamental, doesn't it? The person that I am legally married to and that I have been legally married to for actually quite a while, it's not like we got married and I was applying a week after, because you also have to prove legitimate relationship, which feels insulting, and kind of the system is assuming that you're lying. That the person coming into this country is coming into this country, for nefarious purposes, or that the marriage is simply about getting the person into this country. So your rights as a couple, or my rights as an individual to have the person that I'm married to, in the same country. And then my father, who was not very well, had a stroke. So it was more difficult for me to go over there and visit, and it was absolutely no way was I going to be able to go and live over there, because I needed to, my mother has mental health issues also, so there were issues around that. And then I moved in with my parents after my father had a stroke, because we didn't think he would live very long. In the end, he actually lived 5 years, but that's a sort of slightly separate story. And I hadn't applied for a spouse visa because basically I couldn't afford it. At that point, the threshold was 18,000. It's now 22, 24, and it's going up to 36, which is a lot of money, and I'm a self-employed musician, and my partner comes from poverty. So it already felt quite discriminatory. It wasn't, we just couldn't afford it. And then I discovered, when I started being a carer, a full-time carer on carers allowance, that there was a loophole. That if you are on carers allowance or disability allowance, the financial requirement is waived, which I did not know when I started caring. When I started caring with a capital C, for my dad, I thought, I'm just going to have to put all of my marital stuff on hold, look after me dad till he dies, and then deal with it after. And then when I realised that actually being on carers allowance caused a loophole in the financial requirement, it's called, and that my dad was actually probably not going to die quite as soon as we thought, I then made an application for a spouse visa, and I used an immigration lawyer because I was so, having been refused many times, I decided that I would do that. So that was actually quite expensive, and we had quite a complicated situation where my husband's passport had been stolen and he'd got a new passport. And the date of birth on the new passport was different to the date of birth on the old passport, because he comes from a culture that is not literate. And very often, he also comes from a culture where birthdays are not a thing. So very often people have the 1st of December written as their date of birth, but the passport he'd had previous, the one he'd had nicked, had his actual date of birth on it. And that wasn't something that had been noticed when he reapplied for the passport, because he doesn't really read and write, and he comes from a culture in which people sort of don't. He was also not living in his country of origin. He'd moved from Guinea to the Gambia, so he had to have a residence card, an ID card. That had a different date of birth on it, and it also, I think, possibly had his name spelled in a different way. There's an anglicised spelling of Scylla, which is different from the francophone spelling. Anyway, we were turned down for the visa, and it was very difficult to know if they were saying he was trying to pretend to be more than one person, or that they were questioning his actual identity as a real person, or whether I was saying that I was married to more than one person. It was very unclear exactly what the refusal was about, but it was around the difference in the documents, even though in the application we had said, I mean, my lawyer missed some of it, I think, but it was really stated, you know, these cultures, the passport was stated. I think my lawyer had missed the ID card thing. And he had his passport confiscated by the British government. And we could get no information at all as to where it was, which was quite extraordinary. And I'd had a little bit of experience this with one of the visit visas where some documents had gone missing, and I'd said, these documents haven't been returned, and they went, oh yes they have, and I went, oh no they haven't. And then you're just in this ridiculous ping pong situation of, you know, how do I prove the documents are missing? Because I haven't got them. And they're saying, we gave them back, and I'm going, no you didn't. So it's like, okay, so he's had his passport confiscated. What does that mean? Where is it? And how can we have it back? And I couldn't find anybody to help me with that question. He went to his ambassador in the Gambia. It had got sent to Pretoria for no reason I understand, because at that point, applications were coming through Ghana, through Accra and Ghana. Now it's all done in Sheffield. But it's kind of like Pretoria's never been part of the Commonwealth. Why? Anyway, we never found out and we never got it back. And my worry, of course, is that somehow would have got sold on the black market, and then there would be a person who would be impersonating him. So I then went to my MP, who was Caroline, forgotten, who was the Conservative MP for Derby at that point. And a friend of mine who is a lawyer paid for me to have a lawyer friend of hers who was an immigration expert appeal. The appeal process takes a whole year. So after you have waited and waited and waited and waited for the original decision, you have to wait for a court date, and they make you wait ages for a court date. And it was a complete non-event, as in the Home Office didn't send a representative. And the judge basically said, give the people their piece of paper. She said, you know, a legal document, i.e. a passport, is a legal document and should be recognised as a legal document. And this, I mean, she didn't quite raise her eyebrows, but, you know, it was very, very quick. So it waited and waited and waited all of that time. And if I had been paying for the guy who did it for me, I don't know how much my friend paid him. But, you know, I certainly didn't have the funds for a barrister to fight it. So we got it, and they make you wait and they make you wait and then they make you wait. And then you have a month to get it. You've got your visa. If the person doesn't come here within a month of the visa being granted, it's null and void. So again, after all the waiting around, you suddenly have to, you know, get everything sorted out. And it's very difficult because obviously if you're renting somewhere to live, you've suddenly got to pack everything up. And so it was a massively traumatic sort of situation. Then very sadly, he got here 3 days before lockdown. So it has been very difficult, but we're not finished yet, because a spouse visa is now a 5-year process. You have 2.5 years, then you have to reapply. You have to pay to reapply, and the person has to take another English exam, and you have to pay, because now you have to pay a health surcharge so that the person can use the NHS. And now the whole system is managed by third-party platforms. I think it's called Visa UK, I think. So you don't make an application directly to the Home Office. And there are different, he had you have to have English A1, and it has to go up to B1. You have to take their exam, which costs money, of course. And then you have to take it. There's no centre in Derby to do it. The nearest place for us was Manchester. So we had to go there, which obviously is also expense. The interviews also, I think there were some in Nottingham, but there's a very clever system whereby they say they're free, but all the free ones have been booked for ages and ages. So you end up having to pay for a not free slot because, there's a kind of 3-year backlog of free ones that have been taken up. So it's a very expensive situation. And you can pay extra, to have your documents scanned for them to check it. You can pay extra to be fast-tracked, which gives you another, I think you get your decision in 3 weeks instead of however many weeks. And so we've had to do that. Then the end of the spouse visa, the second time, you can then apply for indefinite leave to remain, which will be our next hurdle. But I am now not caring for my parents, and we do not earn £18,000. So we are, again, back in a situation where after all of this time, it may be not possible for him to stay in this country. And in the meantime, the marriage has been incredibly eroded by the pressures of, obviously COVID hasn't helped, but he's found it very difficult to adjust. There hasn't been enough money for him to go backwards and forwards very many times. And he feels increasingly pressured in that he's allowed to work, but he's not allowed to claim state benefits. And while I was on carer's allowance and claiming universal credit, he doesn't count, obviously, because he's not allowed to claim universal credit. But should he work, that's taken off my universal credit. So it feels like a very unfair situation. And when you say things like that, people go, that can't possibly be true. In the same way that if you say, I'm married to this person, I've been married to them for 12 years, they still don't have right of residence. People go, that can't possibly be true. But it is. So, and I was thinking quite a lot about this with the brief behind this being about looking not just at sort of personal tragedy, but about the structural unfairness. And it does just feel very much like the system is stacked to, unless you are extremely wealthy, there is no right to extended family life under Article 8. That Article 8 has just become a sort of fairy story, really. So that's the kind of bones of the story so far. The personal impact, I think, has been an increasing feeling of powerlessness. And, I am a very well-educated person and a very articulate person. But the struggle has been so difficult. And it's very tied up also with caring for my dad. And my dad died 2 years ago, which is, was in some ways great because he died at home and he had the death that he wanted. And, I did have time with him. But the prolonged battle, I think, is very difficult. And I think the pressure on the marriage has been really extreme, that I feel that for both of us, there's the continual thing of kind of like, kind of expectation, disappointment, which is a very rocky road and very adrenaline fueled. I am having some issues with excess cortisol which is adrenal stuff. And my consultant does feel that stress has been a massive factor. So it's affected my physical health, but I think it's affected my mental health enormously, and it's affected our marriage very badly, because there is a feeling of disappointment and that he doesn't feel welcome in this country. He feels there's an oppositional, I mean, I don't think he feels it, I think it's true, but his experience of being here, you know, he says sometimes things like, your government hates me. And so my experience of that is anger, sadness, and I think it's set up a kind of, you know, it took so long for him to get here that I think I was very, I think my expectations of, I mean, it's a lot of pressure, isn't it? Even if it was a short visa journey, the whole kind of, now it has to be happy ever after. I think that's had a really detrimental effect on the marriage, because I think I've wanted more from him than is actually possible for one person to actually give another person, just because the fight to get him here was so long and so expensive, both in time, and I don't just mean in terms of money, I mean in terms of energy, and that kind of fighting for our right to be together took so much energy that us being together is just like this, not so much, and because it feels like it might still not be possible. So I think the effect for me, I mean, I can feel myself feeling quite upset while I'm talking about it, that there's a real sadness around that it feels, what else do I feel? It feels unfair also, that something as straightforward as a marital relationship is somehow not allowed. And I think that has a very detrimental effect, that what I want, I'm not allowed to have, you know, I'm not allowed to have it, or I have to prove. I mean, that part makes me incredibly angry, that whole thing about proving a valid relationship. I mean, you sort of feel by application number 3, it's just like, surely the fact that we're still applying for a visa proves the fact that this is a genuine relationship, because why would we keep doing it? And I think that unresolved anger has been quite detrimental to my mental health as well, really. The only reason we got this far is because I have quite a high level of education, and also because I have friends who knew the system well enough to help. And that's one of the things that also makes me angry, because that is not justice, that is not fairness in the legal system or the immigration system at all. There should be, you know, I feel very strongly that everybody should have an equal chance, and it feels like that is not, really not so in any way. And that, you know, those of us who are lucky enough to have had a great deal of education and have professional friends are the only people who actually even get this far. And if it's that difficult, then you think about all the people who, you know, who don't. And when you go, I mean, the other thing is that we were treated quite badly in the immigration centre. I mean, we really were looked at like the whole kind of vibe of it was very unpleasant. And that feels really wrong, that a kind of third-party platform is, you know, and there were people in there in really massive states of distress, and no compassion for that, you know, people who'd not understood what they were supposed to have brought, and I think the lack of compassion, the lack of humanity in the system, I think is one of the things that makes me both angry and sad.